Good Arvo, Australia. How you all doing? Did any of you get on the Terps yesterday? So, yeah, I'd say I'll drop the idioms, but there'll be more. This is my first time down here. I'm really happy about it. Really excited. But I've actually, for years, been a massive fan both of Vegemite and of Lucas Papa ointment. So I think I can basically apply for citizenship now. Okay, so yeah, this talk is about idioms and idiomatic Ruby. So the protagonist of this story is idiom. Let me get my mouse cursor out of the way. So idiom in English, when we're talking about natural language, can mean two things. So there's sort of the smaller meaning and the bigger meaning. The first one, the smaller meaning, is a peculiar expression that is commonly understood, sort of a colloquial metaphor. Whereas the second meaning of idiom is the way of speaking, the way of using language that is particular to a specific group of people. So I'll talk a bit about the first and give you some examples, but we're mostly going to focus on the second. So an idiom in the first sense are things like spit the dummy or flat out like a lizard drinking. So these are phrases that if you're learning the language, even though you might know every single word of them, they might still not make sense. You might still not know what they mean. Or if you translate them literally to another language, they probably also don't make sense at all. But people that sort of in that group immediately understand you. That's an idiom. And so both of these meanings can sort of be transferred to programming language. So when we have a Ruby idiom in this first sense, you can think of it as sort of the tiniest of design pattern. So one example of a Ruby idiom would be a method that memoizes, sort of implementing memoization. So you could do that in a variety of ways, but this is the most common way. This is the idiomatic way. So we have a method that conditionally assigns to an instance variable with the same name, but an experienced Rubyist at a glance knows that, okay, I don't need to go into the details, I just see that that's memoization. Similarly, if your method starts with race something something, if something something, and then maybe a couple of those in a row, you know that those are sort of precondition checks. They're not part of the core of what the method's doing. You immediately recognize them as such. They're little patterns that you recognize. Idiom in the second sense is the way that a specific language is used by a specific group of people. So if you would go to Brussels, to the area of the European institutions, you might find that people speak a lot of English, but it's very strange English. They use complicated words where easy ones would do. They use words that you rarely hear in English that are more common in Romance languages, or words that have a different meaning in English, but they're actually used with the meaning that they have in Romance languages. So this is the variety of English that's sort of come to be in the European Parliament and the European institutions. High school language, kids around the world, you know, they reach puberty and they start speaking their own idiom with their peers, which is different from how the language is used by their teachers, by their parents. And this idiom can vary, can change, sort of in two dimensions. So we already mentioned from group to group, so Aussie English is different from American English. But it also changes over time. So we have early English, middle English, modern English. And so the same goes for Ruby. We have different groups within the wider Ruby community that have their own idiom. So Ruby core, if you look at the standard library, it's a different style, a different idiom, different way of using the language than Rails. Rails Ruby has their own way of doing things, their own idiom. Seattle RB, projects like Minitest, Flog, Flay, they're known for having a very particular style, a very particular way of doing things. And then the last one is kind of interesting because it's a more recent phenomenon where Data Mapper and then later Ruby Object Mapper sort of attracted people that sort of started doing things in their own way, building their own tooling, their own metrics on code, and sort of developed a whole own style. So here's a quick example of how these things vary. So look at line 1. There are no parentheses, there are the arguments. You don't see that so much anymore in general Ruby code. On line 2 and line 4, there's an explicit then there, which you could have omitted. But so if you look at the code, this is, I think, from Flog, or it might have been from Flay. all those Seattle RB projects are written in this style very consistently. Okay, so that's the first dimension from group to group, but idiom also changes over time. So I went and I looked at a variety of older Ruby code. I didn't find very old Ruby code, but like I found some interesting examples all from around 2004. So this is from the standard library. What's the first thing that pops out? A 4, an actual 4. Like I'm sure like some people don't even know Ruby has that. So yeah, there's that 4, and if you read it, so there's that. Then you see this always object.new, and then in the end the always returned. So in modern Ruby you could write that with a .tap, or maybe in Rails Ruby from a couple years ago that would have been returning object.new do. And then if you look at the loop, it's doing that 4 to get an index to loop over two arrays in parallel. So you could write that with a zip, sort of more functional way. You know, so modern version of that might look completely different. We'll skip over this a little bit quicker, but so for instance on line 1, it's using this match operator on the rejects instead of the matching operator on the string. It's using the match method. And then on line 6 of this one I find interesting. So it's using the scoping operator to call a class method. And the real funny thing is that these methods are also defined with the scoping operator. Right? So this is code you wouldn't really see that much anymore. So I think in Ruby we can also say that we have early, middle, and modern Ruby. I'm going to kind of arbitrarily delineate this. So 1995 to 2005, I'm going to call early Ruby, aka the primordial ooze. So Ruby is a new language. It's still very niche. There are only early adopters. They're coming from a variety of languages. And so because there is no large body of work yet to look at to see how things are done, everybody kind of takes whatever style they could take from other languages and whatever they figure out whatever comes natural. And so there's naturally a diversity of styles. Ruby is a very flexible language, so there's things that are done in many different ways. And then 2004, 2005, what happens? Rails. So Rails hits the scene, and adoption of Ruby booms. So you get this really interesting situation where suddenly in 2005, 2006, the majority of Rubyists are newbies again. Everybody's been doing it for less than a year. But this time, there is a large body of work to look at. It's the Rails code base. And so because these people are coming in cold, they don't have any strong opinions yet. They kind of just look at what other people are doing. And so a common idiom crystallizes around the Rails code base. But at the same time, these people are coming to Ruby because Ruby's known for programmer happiness. It's a humane language, humanistic, and so there's flexibility, there's creativity. Raise your hand if you came across and read the Poignant Guide in your early years of Ruby. So yeah, lots of hands. So all of that, right? And then fast forward 5 years, and these Rails apps are a little bit older, a little bit more mature. People are realizing that their more creative colleagues from a couple years back are causing them big headaches today. The Rails consultancies are growing and are growing up, and so there's a desire to standardize. People want best practices. People want consistency. And so a common style emerges. And so you can see this in, these are 2 projects from Božidar Bacov. In 2011, he starts writing the Ruby style guide. In 2012, RubyConf is born. And so now this common style has been encoded, has been written down, has been fixed. Now, this modern era, that's sort of the main thing that's been happening. But there's also this pure Ruby crowd that after a couple years of Rails decided that, well, actually, Rails isn't everything. We have other ideas. We want to do other things. And so they're trying out novel approaches, trying out doing things in different ways. And so they develop their own idioms. So we've talked a lot about idiom and how it changes. But why does it matter? Why do we care so much? So we want code to be idiomatic, meaning that it conforms to an idiom. And so when you're talking about natural languages, that means that something sounds natural. When I talk to you and I'm speaking idiomatic English, you kind of very easily understand it. If I say phrases that are grammatically correct but not idiomatic, it takes a bit more cycles to parse it, to understand it. So it's more cognitive overhead. So idiomatic code is code that takes advantage of the features of the language. That's why these ways of doing things have become encoded in the common knowledge, because this is just a good way, a way that you get concise, performant, clean, readable code, making the best use of the language. It's more easily understood by others, especially when it's familiar, and so you get more consistent code. And consistency matters, especially within a project. If all code within a project looks like it's been written by a single person, then it's very easy for anyone to jump around the code base. Whereas if you're like, okay, well, this file has clearly been written by Mark, and I'm not sure if Mark wants me to touch it, you get this turfs within the code, and you don't want that. And again, this reduced cognitive overhead. So consistency, having a consistent idiom within a project is very important. But the question is, who makes these rules, right? So in theory, you could say, okay, well, the Ruby style guide is just encoding what was common knowledge, what the people have been doing. In practice, of course, there's well-known influencers that have influenced that style. So when I went looking for older Ruby code from around 2004, 2005, pretty much anything I came across, I could find things that is just like, okay, this is not how we do it anymore. But when I looked at the Rails code, at David Heinemeier Hansen's code, there was very little of that. It still kind of looked, modern and fresh. So you could say that maybe he was ahead of the time, or maybe the way that we currently write Ruby is largely indebted to his style of writing. And we really like idiomatic in the Ruby community. So I did some hard science and quality data visualization on this. So I looked up on GitHub issues, I typed in idiomatic, noted how many matches I got for each language, and then found some other stats of how many repositories there are in each language on GitHub, and then normalized it so you get kind of a sense of, okay, how much are people talking about idiomatic in certain communities. Now, I don't know what's going on with Go there. You'll have to ask Katrina Owen tomorrow. But if we forget about Go, then you still see that Ruby talks about idiomatic about twice as much as JavaScript, about 3 times as much as Java. So we care. We like code that's idiomatic, and we'll point out when it's not. But there's a downside to this. There's a flip side to this coin. So if you've ever taught newcomers, you'll notice that they do everything wrong. And by everything, I mean everything that doesn't matter. So their indentation is wrong. They use parentheses where you wouldn't put them, and vice versa. They use the wrong side of quotes, like single quotes and not double quotes, or the other way around. But yeah, and some of these, especially when it comes to indentation, it's just like you really have to bite your tongue and just let them do it. Because when you're learning, you don't want them to get that extra burden. It doesn't matter. But when they start engaging in the bigger community, they will have to learn some of that stuff, because they want to contribute to open source project or work in a bigger team. They need to learn that. And so I just had a quick look on current master on RubyConf. How many cops, how many rules are there in RubyConf? Anyone have a guess? 200? Higher? Just to throw a number at me? Lower? 350? Okay, pretty close. So 335 rules. So that's how encoded and how strict we've gotten. And so treating that idiom as dogma, as something that's normative instead of descriptive, can really hamper innovation. And the fact is that times are changing. We've had our modern Ruby, but we're kind of heading towards a postmodern Ruby. So change is always there. The world is changing around us, and when a society changes, its language changes. And this is as much true for Ruby as it is for natural language. So and also when a language comes into contact with other language groups, its language changes. So we just in the last couple of years, distributed systems, parallelization, people are experimenting with different concurrency models because we need better ways of doing concurrency. Type systems, very elaborate type systems are coming on, and so just since 2009 we've had Go, Idris, Elixir, Elm, Rust, all languages that are pushing the envelope, that are coming up with completely new ways of doing things. And so Rubyists are paying attention to that, and they're thinking, okay, what of this can we learn from? What can we take home? And so concepts like monads or functional composition, transducers, communicating sequential processes, these are things that before a few years were completely unseen in Ruby, completely foreign to Ruby. A lot of people probably didn't even think we could ever have them in Ruby. But people are implementing them, experimenting with them, figuring out if there's something there for us to take. And so by necessity, these things will look unfamiliar. So here's the Kleisli gem. Kleisli implements a number of useful monads. This is the try monad, used to chain operations that might raise an exception. This is the maybe monad for chaining operations that might return nil. Here's an example of how it's used in a library. This is also use of the maybe monad. I mean, what this code does exactly is not the point, so I'm not going into detail, but it will look unfamiliar, and there might be this gut response of it's not idiomatic. This is transproc. It's used heavily in ROM. It's kind of a way of specifying and chaining and combining functional transformations of data. This is somewhat similar. Transducers are a way of setting up transformation pipelines on data that can be lazy, that can be parallelized. This is a concept coming from Clojure that's been ported to Ruby. This is agent. This is an implementation of communicating sequential processes. So this is the concurrency model that underlies Go that you also find in Clojure's core async that you can also have in Ruby. So conclusion, idiom is fluid. It always has changed. It always will change. And so don't be too rigid about it. Treat it as fluid. And programming is not just about a machine. It's also a form of expression. It's also language. And so as with writing, as with any art form, you need to find your own voice. You need to find your own way of expressing yourself that works for you. So if any of those Rubocop rules kind of feels unnatural to you, then just disable it for a while and play around and see what works for you. And idiomatic does not mean that something is good. Just because code looks familiar doesn't mean that it's good. Similarly, just because code is not idiomatic or looks unfamiliar does not mean that it's bad. So if you're looking at a library on GitHub and there's not sort of an easy to parse example in the first 10 lines of the README, then you might be tempted to just skip it and find something that you immediately see that example that you can grok. But maybe there's more stuff going on underneath the surface. So ask yourself, okay, what's really going on, and where is the value? So that's all I have. Thank you very much.